The church was full. 300 people dressed in their finest, fanning themselves in the August heat, waiting for the most anticipated wedding the town of Riverdale had seen in 20 years. The groom stood at the altar looking like everything a man is supposed to look like on his wedding day. Tall, handsome, smiling, confident, his suit pressed, his shoes shined, his groomsmen lined up beside him like a row of exclamation points. His name was Kofi Mensah, and he had spent the last 10 years of his life using women like stepping stones and walking away without looking down. 7 women in this town knew exactly who he was. They had each learned it separately, privately, in the particular silence of a woman who has been used and discarded and told, implicitly or explicitly, that no one would believe her if she said anything. They had kept quiet for years, but 3 weeks ago, something happened. One of them found out about the wedding. She made a phone call. That phone call became 2. 2 became 4. 4 became 7 women in a room together for the first time, comparing stories they had each believed were theirs alone, realizing with the particular cold fury of women who have finally found each other that they had all been lied to in the exact same words. And then they made a plan. Not a plan of violence, not a plan of confrontation in some dark place. A plan for today, for this church, for this moment. The bride was already walking down the aisle. She had no idea. But by the time she reached the altar, the world Kofi Mensah had built on other people's silence was going to come apart at every seam. And 300 people were going to watch it happen. Stay with us, because this story will leave you speechless. Hello friends, welcome to our story. Before we start, please like this video, share and subscribe. Also, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Is it United States, London, maybe Canada, Jamaica, South Africa, or anywhere? We want to know.
Every town has a man like Kofi Mensah. He is the man who makes a room feel warmer when he enters it. The man whose laugh is the loudest and most genuine sounding. The man who remembers your name and your mother's name and your birthday, and the thing you mentioned once, briefly, about a dream you had, and brings it up 6 months later as if he had been thinking about it the whole time. He is the man who makes you feel, in his presence, like you are the most interesting person in any room he has ever entered. And he is the man who, once he has what he wants from you, makes you feel as if you imagined the whole thing. Kofi was 34 years old. He had grown up in Riverdale, the only son of a man who had also been charming, also been handsome, also left a trail of quiet wreckage behind him that the town spoke about in lowered voices and then mostly forgot. Kofi had watched his father operate and had learnt, the way sons learn from fathers, that the world had a particular set of rules for men who looked like them and carried themselves the way they did. The rules were these: you could want what you wanted, you could take what you wanted, and if the woman later had feelings about it, that was her problem to manage, not yours. He was not a violent man. He had never raised a hand to anyone in his life, and he was proud of this as if it were virtue rather than simply the baseline of human decency. What he did was subtler, slower, and in some ways more damaging. He chose women carefully. Not randomly. He had a type, and the type was specific. He chose women who were slightly uncertain of themselves, women who were new to town or recently out of something painful or quietly lonely in ways they hadn't told anyone. Women who were ready to believe that a man this attentive, this interested, this full of warmth and eye contact and remembering was the real thing. He was very good at being the real thing for exactly as long as it took. The pattern was consistent across every woman he had ever pursued, though none of them knew it was a pattern because none of them knew about each other. He would find her. He would pursue her with a focus that felt like destiny. He would say things, specific, personal things that made her feel understood. He would move quickly, more quickly than she expected, and the speed of it would feel like certainty rather than urgency. He would make promises. Not always in words, sometimes just in the architecture of his behavior, The calls every day, the showing up, the future tense conversations about where they would go together, what they would build. And then, when something shifted, when she began to expect things, to need things, to occupy space in a way that felt like demand rather than gift, he would begin the withdrawal. Not dramatically. Kofi was never dramatic. He withdrew the way tides withdraw, gradually, almost imperceptibly, until one day you looked down and the water that had been around your ankles was gone and the sand beneath your feet was cold. He would become busy, distracted, present but slightly absent in the way that is harder to confront than absent itself. Her calls would be answered, but briefly. Her questions about what was happening would be met with, "Nothing is happening. You are overthinking this. Why do you always need to make things complicated?" And then one day he simply would not be there anymore. No conversation, no ending. Just the slow and deliberate withdrawal of all the warmth until the woman was standing in the cold, wondering what she had done wrong. That was the cruelest part. The leaving was engineered to feel like her fault. And then 6 months or a year or 2 years later, she would see him across town with someone new, and she would watch him give that new woman the same attention, the same smile, the same focused warmth that had once made her feel like the only person in the world. And she would understand. But by then it was too late. By then the shame had set in. That particular shame that belongs to women who have been used and know it, and believe, because they have been made to believe it, that the knowing is a private matter and the silence is their job. By the count of the 7 women who would find each other 3 weeks before his wedding, Kofi Mensah had run this pattern on every single one of them over the course of 10 years. He had gotten better at it every time.
Their names were Adaeze, Miriam, Sola, Blessing, Fatima, Ruth, and Christy. They ranged in age from 26 to 39. They lived in different parts of Riverdale and moved in different circles and had, in some cases, passed each other on the street without knowing what they shared. They were a teacher, a nurse, a small business owner, a university student, a seamstress, a bank teller, and a woman who ran the best catering operation in the county. What they shared was a year, or a season, or in one case only 8 weeks, of believing that Kofi Mensah was something he was not. And what they shared now was the phone call. It had started with Adaeze. Adaeze was 34, the same age as Kofi, and she had known him the longest. They had gone to school together, grown up on adjacent streets, and when he had turned his attention to her 9 years ago, she had been completely unprepared for how completely he could fill a world. They had been together, if together was even the right word for something that had always felt slightly provisional on his side, for 11 months. Long enough for her to start believing it was real. Long enough for her family to ask questions. Long enough for her to make plans she had not told him about yet, in the careful, hopeful way women make plans around men who have not committed, but who have implied commitment at every turn. And then he had withdrawn, gradually, precisely, expertly. She had spent a long time wondering what she had done. She had spent a longer time knowing she hadn't done anything. But she had been silent, because what would she say? And to whom? And who would believe her? And what words would adequately describe a thing that had left no marks but had damaged her in ways she was still, 9 years later, occasionally discovering? She had been silent until 3 weeks ago when her cousin called her from across town and said, "Did you see the announcement? Kofi Mensah is getting married." Adaeze had put down her phone and sat very still. Then she had picked it up again and called Miriam. She had only known that Kofi and Miriam had history because she had once seen them together briefly on a street corner 2 years after her own experience with him. She had filed the observation away without comment. She had not wanted to be the kind of woman who talked about men to other women. She had not wanted to be that person. But now she called Miriam. And Miriam, who was 31 and worked as a nurse and had her own 11 months of knowing Kofi Mensah, said, "I heard." There was a silence on the phone. Then Adaeze said, "I think we need to talk." The first meeting was just the two of them at Adaeze's house in the evening with the curtains closed and wine on the table because some conversations require wine. They talked for 4 hours. They discovered across those 4 hours that the man they had separately known was not two versions of the same person adapted slightly for each woman, but exactly the same. The same words, the same gestures, the same precise sequence of pursuit and withdrawal. The same lines, and they were lines delivered with practiced naturalness that in some cases were word for word identical. The restaurant he had taken them to for the third date, the specific thing he had said about feeling like he had been waiting for them without knowing he was waiting. The way he had used the word home when he didn't mean a building. Adaeze laughed when Miriam recited it, not because it was funny, because she recognized every syllable, and the recognition was dizzying. "Do you know anyone else?" Miriam had asked, and they had started making calls.
They met on a Wednesday evening in Sola's sitting room. Sola ran the catering business and had the largest house and the most practical mind of the group, and when Adaeze had called her, she had said very little but had arranged everything with the efficiency of a woman who knows how to feed 300 people and can certainly arrange chairs for 7. They arrived one by one. Some of them knew each other, some did not. Some had suspected from things they had noticed over the years that they were not alone in their experience. Some were genuinely shocked to walk into a room and find 5 other women who had their story. They sat in a circle with food on the table that no one ate. Each woman told her story. There were rules established by Sola before anyone spoke, because Sola believed in structure. No one interrupts. No one minimizes. No one says at least. When one person speaks, everyone listens, really listens, the way women should have been listened to the first time. It took 3 hours. By the end of the 3 hours, the room was both devastated and electric. Devastated because hearing 7 versions of the same cruelty laid end to end is a devastating thing. Electric because of what the devastation made visible. They had all been alone for years with something that had not been a private experience at all. It had been a system, a deliberate, practiced system applied to them one after another by a man who had never expected them to find each other because he had made sure each of them believed she was isolated. He had been wrong about that. The woman he was about to marry was a woman named Amara. She had moved to Riverdale 14 months ago from a city 4 hours away. She was 29 years old, a financial analyst, a woman with a kind face and a sharp mind, and no reason yet to know what the women in this room knew. She had met Kofi at a church event. He had pursued her with his full, focused warmth. She had told a colleague, who had mentioned it to Adaeze, that she felt like she had finally found someone who truly saw her. She was planning a church wedding. She was planning a life. She had no idea. The question the 7 women faced was this: what do you do with the truth when someone is about to be harmed by a lie? And what do you do when the only people who can stop it are people whose word, individually, can be dismissed as bitterness and ex-girlfriend drama? It was Fatima who said it first. "Not one of us," she said. "Alone, we are all angry exes with nothing but stories. Together, we are evidence." The room was quiet. "Evidence," Miriam repeated. "Evidence," Fatima said firmly. She opened her phone. She had saved everything. The messages, the voice notes, the promises, because Fatima was a bank teller, and bank tellers understand documentation. One by one, the other women unlocked their phones. Sola had screenshots of messages she had saved without knowing why, in the way people save things that hurt them because the saving feels like a form of not losing what happened. Ruth had the letter. The actual handwritten letter Kofi had given her in the early days, the one with the words that had made her cry for the right reasons before she learned to cry for the wrong ones. Christy had recorded a voicemail, one she had listened to hundreds of times in the year after, trying to understand how a voice that warm could belong to a person that cold. They laid everything on the table. It was substantial,
Not just in feeling, but in form. Messages, voice notes, letters, photographs, a timeline that showed the pattern repeated across 7 women over 10 years with the consistency of someone who did not make mistakes because he did not think he was doing anything wrong. "This is enough," Adaize said quietly. "This is more than enough." But the question remained, what to do with it? They could go to Amara directly, show up at her door, sit across from her the way they were sitting now, and lay the evidence on her table and tell her what they knew. Some of them wanted to do exactly that, but Ruth, who was 39 and the oldest in the room and had been burned the longest ago and had thought about this longer than anyone, said, "She won't believe us, not like this, not strangers at her door the week before her wedding. She will see 7 bitter women and she will choose to believe the man she loves because we all chose to believe the man we loved, and that is what love does to your judgment at the beginning." "She is right," Sola said. "So then what?" Blessing asked. Ruth looked around the room. "We don't go to her," she said. "We let her make her choice freely, but we make sure that the truth is present at the wedding, available, undeniable, in a form she cannot be talked out of because it is not being delivered to her in private where he can reshape it later. It is delivered in public, in front of everyone, in front of his family, his friends, his community, in a place where the truth has witnesses." The room was very still. "The wedding," Adaize said slowly. "The wedding," Ruth confirmed. "No shouting," Sola said. "No scene making. We are not women who make scenes." "No," Ruth agreed. "We are women who prepare." They talked for another 2 hours. When they left Sola's house, it was past midnight, and they had a plan.
The plan was elegant in its simplicity. They would each attend the wedding. Individually, this would raise no suspicion. Riverdale was a town of interconnected social circles, and a wedding of this size would naturally include people from every corner of the community. Several of them had invitations already. Others could arrive with people who did. They would sit in different parts of the church, not clustered together, not visibly coordinated, just 7 women scattered among 300 guests. They would bring their evidence, printed, organized, identical sets of documents, the messages, the timeline, the photographs, the letter, compiled by Fatima with the thoroughness of someone who had spent 15 years ensuring that numbers added up and discrepancies did not disappear. They had made 30 copies, 30 envelopes, each envelope addressed by hand to Amara. And the plan, the part of the plan that had been the most carefully considered, the most debated, the part that Ruth had argued for and Adaize had initially resisted, and eventually, at 2 in the morning in Sola's sitting room, agreed was right, was this. The envelopes would not be delivered before the wedding. Not at the door, not at the reception, not at any moment that could be controlled and managed and explained away by a man who was very good at explaining things away. They would be delivered at the moment the officiant asked the question that every wedding officiant asks. The question that exists according to Christie, who had researched the history of the tradition, precisely because marriages were once public contracts that the public had the right to contest. Does anyone here know of any reason why these 2 people should not be lawfully joined? That question. The moment the officiant spoke those words, Ruth would stand. Not shout, not perform, stand. And she would say, in a clear and steady voice, "Yes, I do." And then, before Kofi could speak, before anyone could rush to silence her, in the brief window of stunned collective silence that follows an unexpected thing in a church, Adaize would move through the pews, and Miriam and Sola, and each woman in her seat would do the same, and the envelopes would be distributed to the people around them. 30 envelopes, 30 people holding the truth in their hands, 30 people who could open what they held and see in documented form what the man at the altar had spent 10 years doing. And then Amara could decide, with the truth in her hands and 300 witnesses around her, with no private conversation to be managed afterward, with no version of events that could be reshaped in a quiet room. She could decide freely. That was what Ruth kept saying in the days of preparation that followed. Not revenge, she told them each time the energy in the group tilted towards something hotter.
We are not doing this for revenge. We are doing this so that one more woman does not walk into what we walked into. We are doing this so that Amara can choose, freely, with her eyes open. We are doing this because no one did it for us. That last sentence landed differently for each woman. For Adiaze, who was 25 and in love and had not known what was happening until it was done, it landed with the specific ache of a wound that had always needed exactly this acknowledgement. For Christy, who was 26 and the youngest, and whose 8 weeks with Kofi happened just 18 months ago and had not yet finished hurting, it landed as something close to relief. For Ruth, who had been carrying this the longest, it landed as the weight of 30 envelopes in a bag being worth every year of the carrying. They prepared. They waited. The wedding day came.
Kofi Mensah woke on his wedding day, feeling, as he often felt, like a man whose life was arranged correctly. He showered and dressed slowly, with the deliberateness of a man performing a ritual he has been looking forward to. His suit was charcoal, the exact shade his mother had helped him choose, and it fit precisely because he had been measured 3 times to ensure it. He spent 20 minutes on his shoes. He was not a nervous groom. Nerves were for men who doubted, and Kofi had no doubts about today. He had found in Amara something he had not found in the women before her, a woman who asked nothing from him that he was not willing to give. She was grateful for his attention without demanding more of it than he offered. She fit around his life with a flexibility that the other women, with their expectations and their needs and their eventual questions, had not managed. She was perfect for him. This was what he told himself. He did not think about the women before her. He had never been the kind of man who dwelt on what was past. That, he would have told you, was actually a virtue. He was a forward-looking person. He did not see the use in guilt, which was simply the past trying to contaminate the present. He checked himself in the mirror one more time. He was ready. He drove to the church with his best man, a childhood friend named Kwame, who made easy jokes about the end of freedom, and Kofi laughed at them with the ease of a man who did not feel he was giving anything up. At the church, guests were already filling the pews. He greeted people warmly as he moved through the gathering crowd, shaking hands, embracing friends, receiving congratulations with the modest pleasure of a man who believed he deserved them. He did not notice Adaize in the 7th row on the left. He did not notice Miriam at the end of a pew near the back. He did not notice any of them because why would he? They were simply women he had known at various points in his life, women who had moved on as he had moved on, and their presence at his wedding was simply evidence that Riverdale was a small town and that he was well connected and widely liked. He stood at the altar. He waited for his bride.
Amara had been awake since 4 in the morning. Not from nerves exactly, from a particular wakefulness that belongs to days that feel significant. The feeling of being at the edge of something large and not being able to sleep because the largeness is pressing against the inside of your chest. She had spent the morning with her mother and her best friend, a woman named Dara, who had driven from the city the day before and who had been making her laugh since 7 a.m. in the way that only people who have known you for 20 years can make you laugh, fully, without effort, at things that aren't quite jokes. She was happy. She wanted to be clear about that, even to herself, because she had learned that the word happy was one she had used carelessly before, and she was trying to use it more honestly now. She was genuinely, clearly, eyes open happy. Kofi was not perfect. She had never expected perfection, but he was warm and attentive, and he made her feel chosen, which was a feeling she had not had enough of in the years before. Dara had done her makeup. Her mother had done the buttons on the back of her dress, 32 small pearl buttons that had taken 11 minutes, and her mother had counted each one. The dress was ivory silk with long sleeves and a train that she had worried was too much and had decided after trying it on 4 times was exactly right. She looked at herself in the full-length mirror in the bridal room at the back of the church. She thought, this is me. This is actually me in this dress on this day. Her mother was crying already.
"Don't you dare," Amara told her. "I'm not," her mother said, clearly crying. The music changed in the church. The signal. It was time. Amara took her father's arm. Her father, 61 years old and a man of very few words, looked at his daughter and said, "You look like your grandmother." It was the most he had said all morning. It was enough. They walked toward the doors.
The doors opened. The church rose to its feet. The music swelled, and Amara walked forward into the warm interior of the church, into the smell of flowers and candles, and the specific charged air of 300 people gathered in one place for one purpose. And she saw Kofi at the altar, and he was crying, genuinely crying, the way he always cried at significant moments. And she thought, this is real. Whatever else is uncertain in the world, this is real. She walked. In the 7th row on the left, Adeze watched her come. She had not expected to feel what she felt watching Amara walk down that aisle. She had thought she would feel the clean edge of purpose, the mission, the plan, the thing they had organized and prepared for. Instead, she felt something more complicated. She felt the specific ache of recognizing, in this woman walking toward a decorated altar in an ivory dress, every version of herself that had once believed the same thing with the same open face. She felt the necessity of what was about to happen with a clarity that was almost physical. Amara reached the altar. She and Kofi faced each other. He took her hands. He smiled at her with the full, focused warmth of his attention, and she smiled back with the full, open trust of hers. The officiant began.
The ceremony moved through its stages the way ceremonies move. The readings, the prayers, the peculiar solemn rhythm of words said in this order, in this room, at this kind of moment for centuries. Kofi said his vows with conviction. He was good at conviction. Amara said hers with a quieter certainty that was more moving, because quieter certainty is harder to produce and easier to believe. The rings were exchanged. And then the officiant paused, the way officiants pause at this particular moment, giving the words their due weight before speaking them. He looked out at the congregation with the practiced gaze of a man who had asked this question at hundreds of weddings and never once received an answer. "If anyone here," he began, "knows of any lawful reason why these two people should not be joined in marriage." Ruth stood up. She had been a secondary school teacher for 14 years. She was accustomed to rooms. She was accustomed to the specific quality of attention that a room gives when something unexpected happens, and she knew how to use the silence that follows surprise. She stood, and she said in a voice that was perfectly steady and perfectly clear, "Yes, I do." The silence was absolute. 300 people turned. Kofi's face, and this was the moment that every person in that church would describe later in their own account of the day, would return to again and again as the precise image of a man watching his constructed world begin to crack. Kofi's face went through several things at once. The first was surprise. The second was recognition. He knew Kofi, of course he knew her, and the recognition brought with it a cascade of understanding about what this might be that he was not fast enough to conceal. The third was the beginning of the management response, the smile, the controlled affect, the reaching for the familiar tool of his charm. But the silence had stretched too long for charm to work in it. He said with remarkable composure, "Ruth, I have something to share with the people in this room," Ruth said. She reached into her bag, and the women in 7 different points in the church reached into their bags simultaneously, about the man standing at this altar. "Amara," Kofi said, turning to his bride, his voice warm and low and already beginning the work of reframing. "Don't listen to—" Amara was not listening to him.
She was watching the envelopes moving through the pews.
It took 4 minutes. 4 minutes during which the church was not silent. There were voices, murmurs, Kofi's best man Kwame stepping forward and then stopping, Kofi's mother rising from the front pew, the officiant saying something no one listened to, but underneath all of it was the movement. 7 women and the people around them passing envelopes hand to hand along the rows, quiet and deliberate, the way ushers pass collection plates. 30 envelopes. 30 people sitting in that church, suddenly holding something. The envelopes were cream-colored, simple, addressed by hand to Amara in Fatima's careful script, sealed. But the people holding them could feel the weight of them. Multiple pages, something substantial inside. Amara stood at the altar and watched it happen. She had not moved. Her father, standing slightly behind and to her left where he had walked her, put one hand on her shoulder. Not pulling her away, not telling her what to do, just present, just there. Kofi was speaking. He was good at speaking in difficult moments. He had deployed this skill many times in his life, the skill of talking a situation into a different shape, and he was using it now with everything he had. He was saying that Ruth was someone he had dated years ago, briefly, that things had not ended well, that this was a painful and inappropriate intrusion at what should be. Adeaze stood up. She didn't say anything. She simply stood. Then Miriam stood. Then Sola. Then Blessing and Fatima and Christy. 7 women on their feet in different parts of the church in silence, and the silence of 7 women standing is louder than most sounds. Kofi stopped speaking. He looked at them, one by one, and in his face, in the specific quality of the stillness that replaced the talking, was the recognition that this was not one angry ex-girlfriend. This was not 2. This was not a manageable thing. This was organized, deliberate, documented, and there were 30 people in this church holding something in their hands, and the thing in their hands was him. He turned to Amara. He said her name. She was looking at the woman nearest to her in the second pew, who was holding an envelope and looking at Amara with a question in her face. Do you want this? Amara looked at the envelope. Then she looked at Kofi. She had a very still face. She had always had a still face. It was one of the things Kofi had liked about her, the impression of composure, of being unflappable. He had read it as flexibility, as easiness. He had been wrong about what it was. It was not easiness. It was the particular stillness of a woman who thinks before she acts and does not let other people's urgency become her own. She looked at him for a long time. Then she turned to the woman in the second pew and said, "Yes, please." She took the envelope. She opened it. She read. The church had gone very quiet. The kind of quiet that is not peaceful but held. 300 people collectively deciding not to speak, not to move, not to do anything that might interrupt the moment happening at the altar. Amara read the first page, then the second. She was a financial analyst. She read documents for a living. She understood how to extract information from organized data quickly and completely, and the document in her hands was organized with the precision of someone who had understood that it needed to be. The messages were there, the timeline, the letter in Kofi's own handwriting addressed to Ruth with the words that he had also, she would later discover, written almost identically to Adeaze. Miriam's name was in the document. All their names, the dates, the pattern visible across 10 years as clearly as a line on a graph. She turned the page, and then another. Kofi had stopped trying to speak. Something in Amara's face had told him that speaking was not the tool for this moment, and he was, even now, strategic enough to know when a tool would make things worse. His best man Kwame had put a hand on his arm. Whether in support or restraint was not entirely clear. Kofi's mother sat in the front pew with her hands clasped and her face carrying the expression of a woman who is being shown something she already knew and is only now having to admit she knew. Amara finished reading. She lowered the document. She did not cry, not then.
The crying would come later, privately, in the appropriate time and place, and it would be thorough and honest and eventually finished. But in this moment, she was too clear for crying, too focused in the specific way of a person who has just received information that rearranges everything and is in the 30 seconds before the rearranging fully lands. She looked at Kofi. He looked back at her. And what was between them in that look was not love exactly, not anymore, not in the uncomplicated form it had been 10 minutes ago when she had walked down the aisle toward him. What was between them was the specific, irreversible moment of someone finally seeing something true about a person they have been seeing falsely. She said, "How many?" Not as a question, as a request for accurate information. Kofi said nothing. 7, Ruth said from across the church, "that we know of." The words landed in the quiet like stones in still water, the ripple going outward through the pews. 7 women, Adaeze said, her voice clear and steady. 10 years, the same words to every one of us, and then nothing. Amara looked at the women standing around the church. 7 of them, on their feet, not performing, not dramatic, simply present and visible, and finally not invisible. She looked at them for a long time. Then she looked back at Kofi. She said, "Did you love any of them?" The church was completely silent. Kofi's mouth opened. He had 100 things he could say. He was a man with a gift for saying things. But in that specific silence, in front of those specific women who had heard all his things and documented them and brought them here, the things dissolved. He said nothing. That was the answer. Amara nodded once, the smallest nod of a woman processing accurate information. Then she turned to her father. He was already beside her, one hand extended, the way fathers extend hands when they know the next thing. She took his arm. She looked at the officiant. "I won't be needing you to finish," she said. Her voice was perfectly level. "Thank you." She walked back down the aisle. The church was so quiet that her footsteps were audible on the stone floor, precise, unhurried, entirely her own. Her father walked beside her. Her mother rose from the front pew and followed. Her best friend Dara, who had been sitting 3 rows back with her hand pressed over her mouth for the last 8 minutes, stood up and followed too. At the door, Amara paused. She turned once and looked back at the 7 women, still standing in their places around the church. She did not say anything. There were no words available yet for what needed to be said, and she understood that. But she looked at each of them, one by one, the specific look of a woman acknowledging other women who have done something that cost them something.
What happened after Amana left was not dramatic in the way that movies are dramatic. There was no explosion, no one charged the altar, no one screamed or wept or collapsed. What happened was quieter and more devastating than any of those things. People began, one by one, to leave. Not rushing, not with any visible anger or performance of moral outrage, simply leaving. The way people leave a place where they suddenly understand they are not witnessing a celebration, but a reckoning, and the reckoning is not theirs to witness. They gathered their things, and they filed out, and they left Kwame and his groomsmen and the officiant and his mother standing in a church that emptied itself around them. Within 15 minutes, the church was nearly empty. His mother was the last to leave. She did not speak to him. She put on her hat and her gloves, and she walked past him at the altar, and she did not look at him, and the not looking was its own entire language. He stood at the altar. The flowers were still there. The candles were still lit. The arch of white roses that the decorator had spent 3 hours arranging that morning was intact and fragrant and entirely indifferent to what had just happened beneath it. Kwame sat in the front pew. He had not left. Of everyone, only Kwame remained, and Kwame sat with his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor. Kofi came down from the altar and sat beside him. They sat in silence for a long time. Then Kwame said, "I knew. Not everything, but enough. I should have said something." Kofi looked at the floor. "What would you have said?" he asked. "And to whom?" Kwame didn't answer. There was no answer, and they both knew it.
The women went to Sola's house. It was not planned. It simply happened the way things happen when a group of people have been through something large together and do not want to separate immediately afterward. They arrived in ones and twos over the course of an hour, and Sola, who had anticipated this without knowing she had, made food. Not the event catering she did for 300 people. Ordinary food, rice and stew and fried plantain and cold drinks, and the specific comfort of a meal made in a real kitchen by someone who understood that sometimes the most necessary thing is something warm that someone made for you. They ate. They talked. Not about Kofi, not very much. He occupied less of the conversation than he had occupied in each of their lives for the past years, and this felt significant. He was present as a fact they had resolved, not as a center they continued to orbit. They talked about themselves. They told each other the other parts of their stories, the parts that didn't intersect with Kofi, the parts that were simply their lives. Adaize talked about the master's degree she had finished the previous year and how she had almost not applied because of what had happened to her confidence in the year after Kofi. Christy, the youngest, talked about what she wanted to do next, and the 7 women in the room listening to her with the full attention of people who understood exactly how it felt to be 26 and need someone to hear you. Ruth sat in the corner with a glass of palm wine and looked, for the first time in a long time, at peace. Not happy exactly, settled. The particular settledness of a woman who has done the thing she needed to do. At some point in the evening, Adaize's phone rang. She looked at the screen. She looked around the room. "It's Amara," she said. The room went still. She answered. The call lasted 22 minutes. Adaize mostly listened. She said yes several times, and "I understand," and "she is right here if you want to speak with her," looking at Ruth when she said it. At the end, she said, "You owe us nothing, but if you want to talk to any of us for any reason, we are here." She hung up. She looked at the 6 faces watching her. She said she had been feeling something was wrong for 3 weeks. She couldn't name it, just a feeling. She says she's grateful she doesn't have to carry that feeling alone anymore. The room was quiet. Then Sola got up and brought more food, and the evening continued. The truth about what happens to men like Kofi Mensah after a day like that one is not always what we want it to be. It is not always a dramatic fall. It is not always a legal consequence, a public shaming sufficient to match the private damage, a punishment proportional to the harm. What happened to Kofi was this. The town knew. It had seen. 300 people had been in that church, and 300 people had the kind of memory that weddings produce. Sharp, detailed, lasting. The envelopes had been opened, the documents had been read, the pattern had been made visible not in the privacy of whispered conversations but in the full light of a public ceremony attended by his family and colleagues and community. He could not explain it away. He tried. In the weeks that followed, he had conversations with his friends, with his family, with people he ran into at work and church and the market, in which he offered versions of events that softened the edges. Ex-girlfriends who couldn't let go. Coordinated attacks by women with personal grievances, a misunderstanding given a dramatic staging. Some people listened. Some people chose to believe a version of events they found more comfortable, but enough people didn't. His job, he worked in a management role at a company in town, became difficult in the specific way that workplaces become difficult when people in them know something about you that you cannot address directly. He was not fired, but his authority in the room was not what it had been. People heard him differently now. His mother did not speak to him for 6 weeks.
When she began speaking to him again, it was with a reserve that had not been there before, a slight stepping back from the man she had always believed he was. She loved him, she was his mother, but she had been in that church. She had seen the women stand. She had held her hands in her lap and looked at the floor and understood something about her son that she had always had the option of not understanding before. The women he had wronged got on with their lives. This is the part that is most important. This is the part that is most true. Adeaze applied for a position she had talked herself out of twice before and got it. She credited in the year that followed this specific clarity that had come from walking into Sola's sitting room and finally saying out loud what had happened to her, to people who heard it accurately, as the thing that had given her the particular kind of confidence that had been missing. Christy finished her degree. She told her story anonymously on an online forum for young women, and the response, hundreds of women recognizing the pattern she described, made her decide to write about it in a longer form. She was 27 when she published the first piece. It was read by more people than she expected. Ruth retired from teaching the following year. She traveled. She visited her sister in another country and stayed for 3 months and came home brown from the sun and more herself than she had been in a long time. Miriam met someone. It took her 2 years after the wedding to trust her own judgment enough to try, and when she did, she chose with the particular care of a woman who now knew exactly what the warning signs looked like. The man she chose was nothing like Kofi, which was the first thing she had noticed about him. Amara went back to the city she had come from. She called Adeaze once more, 6 months later, not for anything specific, but because she wanted to say that she was okay, that she had found a therapist, that she was taking her time, that she had worn the dress once more, alone, at home, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, and then given it to a consignment shop where it would find someone to whom it meant something clean. She said, "I keep thinking about the moment I walked back down that aisle, and I think it might be the bravest thing I've ever done. And then I think, the bravest thing wasn't me. The bravest thing was 7 women who did it first."
The flowers at the church were taken down the same afternoon. A volunteer with the church cleaned up the candles, stacked the programs, folded the decorations away into boxes that went back into the storage room where they would wait for the next occasion. By the following Sunday, the church looked exactly as it always had. Churches are good at returning to themselves. So are women. The 7 of them still met sometimes, not as a group organized around a shared wound. That meeting was over. It had served its purpose. But in pairs and threes, because the thing that had happened had made them real to each other, and real is not something you easily undo. Sola catered Miriam's engagement party 2 years later. Adeaze was there. Ruth sent a gift from across the world. Fatima, who had organized the documents with the precision of a woman who had never wasted a system in her life, kept a copy of everything in a folder that she sometimes thought about burning and sometimes thought about keeping, and eventually put into a drawer where it remained in case it was ever needed for anything, and never was. Christy wrote about all of it, changed names, changed enough details, but kept the structure of it because the structure was the point. The structure was the thing that had been invisible to each woman alone and visible the moment they were in a room together. 1 woman's story is anecdote. 7 women's stories is a pattern. And a pattern is not dismissible the way a single voice is dismissible in a church or a courtroom or anywhere else. Here is what they had known before that day, but had not known they all knew. Silence protects the wrong people. Not always, not in every situation, but in this specific situation, in the situation of a man who operates on the assumption that the women he wrongs will each carry their experience alone, will each believe they are isolated, will each absorb the shame he deposited with them and keep it private. Silence is not safety. Silence is the thing that makes the next woman possible. The next woman. That was what Adeaze had said to herself the night she made the first phone call to Miriam. Not this is revenge, not this is justice, just the next woman. If they stayed silent, there would be a next woman after Amara, and the woman after that. And the man at the altar would learn only that silence was guaranteed, that his system was safe, that the woman he moved through the world leaving damage in had an agreement, unspoken, never made, but apparently reliable not to speak. The agreement was broken now.
And the man who had relied on it would have to rebuild himself, if he chose to rebuild at all, in full knowledge that the next time he tried to construct a life on other people's silence, the silence might not hold. That is not a happy ending in the clean sense, but it is a true one. And sometimes the truest endings are the ones that don't tie up neatly, but leave the door open to the possibility that people can become different, that damage can be named and stopped, that 7 women in a room together are more powerful than one man who thought he had found the perfect system. He hadn't. He had simply found, until that Wednesday night in Sola's sitting room, women who didn't yet know each other. Now they did. Have you ever known someone who ran this kind of pattern, who operated on the assumption that silence was guaranteed? And what would you have done if you had been Amara walking back down that aisle? Would you have kept walking? Let us know in the comments. Kindly like, share, and subscribe. Comment where you're watching from and your thoughts. Which woman in this story did you see yourself in most? Thank you, and see you in the next video.